Blood on white marble, a shattered crystal glass, and the cold steel of a revolver pressing gently under her jaw. He leaned in, the scent of expensive cologne and gunpowder washing over her. "You belong to me now," he whispered. But Roman didn't realize he had just handed her the keys to his complete destruction. Chloe Bennett lived a life of quiet precision. As a senior art appraiser for a prestigious auction house in Boston, her days were dictated by carbon dating, provenance documents, and the silent histories of oil on canvas. She was meticulous, analytical, and completely unprepared for the world of Roman Cavallaro. It started with a private commission, a lucrative, off-the-books request to catalog a newly inherited private collection at a sprawling, Gilded Age estate in Newport, Rhode Island. The client was anonymous, represented only by a notoriously tight-lipped law firm. The fee offered was triple her annual salary, with one strict condition: utter confidentiality. When Chloe arrived at the cliffside mansion, the Atlantic Ocean crashing aggressively against the rocks below, she was met not by a frail heir, but by Roman. He was a man carved from absolute authority. Tailored Italian suits couldn't hide the dangerous, predatory grace in his movements. He had the kind of dark, piercing eyes that didn't just look at you, they stripped away your defenses and catalogued your weaknesses. "Miss Bennett," Roman had said, his voice a smooth, low baritone that vibrated in the cavernous foyer, "I expect absolute discretion. What is in this house stays in this house." For the first week, the job was a dream. The collection was staggering: Modigliani, an undocumented Caravaggio, a stunningly preserved Goya. But as Chloe dug into the provenance of the paintings, the historical paper trail proving their legitimacy, she noticed the discrepancies. They were brilliant, virtually undetectable to the naked eye. But Chloe wasn't looking with the naked eye. She was looking at micro-stamping on customs forms from the 1980s that used a font invented in 2004. The art wasn't just undocumented, it was blood money. The paintings were physical currency, a sophisticated front used to launder millions of dollars across international borders. The staggering valuations she was being paid to authorize were simply mechanisms to wash dirty money clean. Panic set in. Chloe knew that people who moved money like this didn't let witnesses walk away. On her 9th night at the estate, she made her move. Waiting until the house was deadly quiet, she crept into the opulent library where she had set up her workstation. She needed insurance. Pulling out a micro flash drive, she began copying the forged provenance files and the hidden digital ledgers she had cracked on Roman's private server. She was at 92% when the heavy oak doors clicked shut and locked. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She turned slowly. Roman was leaning against the doorway, a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. Beside him stood Victor, his right-hand man, whose knuckles were thick with scar tissue. "I hired you for your brilliant eye, Chloe," Roman said, stepping into the dim light. "I didn't expect you to turn it on me." Chloe backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just finishing the appraisal." Roman chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He crossed the room, his presence suffocatingly large, and slammed his hand down on the desk, right next to her laptop. He reached out, his long fingers trailing dangerously down the side of her neck, feeling the frantic pulse of her carotid artery. "You're a terrible liar," he murmured, "and a thief." "Let me go," Chloe managed to say, her voice trembling but her chin held high. "I haven't told anyone, I swear." "Oh, I know you haven't," Roman replied smoothly. He grabbed the flash drive from the laptop and crushed it under the heel of his Oxford shoe. "Because if you had, we wouldn't be having this conversation. You'd already be at the bottom of the Narragansett Bay." He leaned in close, his lips grazing her ear. The terrifying thrill of his proximity sent a confusing shiver down her spine. "You thought you could outsmart me in my own house? You just appraised your own life, Chloe. And, unfortunately for you, your skills are too valuable to dispose of." He pulled back, his eyes dark and commanding. "You don't work for the auction house anymore. You don't have an apartment in Boston anymore. From this second forward, your life is mine. You will fix my books. You will legitimize my empire. You belong to me now." Chloe stared at him, the gravity of her nightmare settling in. She was a prisoner to one of the most ruthless syndicate bosses on the East Coast. But as she looked into Roman's eyes, a spark of pure, unadulterated defiance ignited in her chest. He thought he had broken her. He thought she was just a civilian. He could terrify into submission. "Fine," she thought, her expression smoothing into a mask of cold compliance. "I belong to you. Let's see how long your empire survives with me on the inside." The transition from independent woman to the property of the Cavallaro family was brutal, yet entirely invisible to the outside world. To her friends and colleagues back in Boston, Chloe had simply accepted an exclusive, long-term contract in Europe. Roman had seen to that, manufacturing an impeccable digital footprint, fake emails from her account, staged photos in Paris, a flawless cover story. In reality, Chloe was confined to the Rhode Island estate. She was given a suite of rooms more luxurious than a five-star hotel, complete with a balcony overlooking the ocean. But the heavy oak doors locked from the outside at night, and two armed guards, usually a silent bruiser named Dominic and the ever-watchful Victor, trailed her everywhere else. Her days were spent in the subterranean office of the mansion, surrounded by servers and mountains of paperwork. Her task was monumental. Roman's organization, which controlled illicit shipping routes and gambling rings from Providence to Atlantic City, had grown too fast. The FBI was circling, specifically a relentless task force led by Special Agent Daniel Cross. Roman needed his millions washed faster and more legitimately than ever before. Chloe was forced to weave a tapestry of lies, turning extortion money into high-end real estate investments and rare antiquities, but proximity to the devil began to blur the lines of her morality. Roman was not a caricature of a mobster. He was hyper-intelligent, ruthlessly efficient, and surprisingly cultured. They spent evenings in the library, forced into each other's company. He would read Machiavelli or modern economic theory while sipping scotch, occasionally testing her with sharp, probing questions. One stormy Tuesday, the power grid flickered and died. The estate's backup generators hummed to life, but only for the essential systems. Chloe found Roman in the conservatory, staring out at the violent, lightning-streaked sea. "You're working late," he observed, without turning around. "Your Cayman Island accounts were a mess. Someone tried to skim $300,000 off the top," Chloe replied, stepping into the room. She had made herself indispensable. That was her armor. Roman turned slowly. "Who?" "Your underboss in New Jersey, Paulie." A dark shadow crossed Roman's face. He walked toward her, closing the distance until she could feel the heat radiating from him. "You're sure?" "The numbers don't lie, Roman. People do." He reached out, his thumb gently tracing her jawline. It was a gesture he used often, a calculated mix of intimidation and an undeniable, electric attraction that they were both silently fighting. "You've been very useful, Chloe. I might actually be fond of you." "A pet is useful until it bites," she whispered, holding his gaze. "Then I'll just have to make sure you never want to bite," he murmured, his face inches from hers. The tension was suffocating. She hated him for taking her life, yet in moments like this, she felt a terrifying magnetic pull toward the darkness in him. But Chloe hadn't surrendered. Her submission was a meticulously crafted illusion. While she fixed his books, she was also planting seeds. She had discovered a blind spot in Roman's IT infrastructure. Using fragments of code she hid within the metadata of the art appraisal files, she was slowly building an encrypted backdoor. She was creating a breadcrumb trail that, when activated, would lead Agent Daniel Cross directly into the heart of Roman's financial servers. The psychological toll, however, was devastating. A week after she exposed the skimming, Roman forced her to attend a formal dinner at the estate. It was a gathering of his top lieutenants. Chloe sat at Roman's right hand, dressed in a stunning, backless, emerald gown he had purchased for her, a beautiful bird on display. Halfway through the dinner, the dining room doors opened. Two of Victor's men dragged Paulie into the room. The New Jersey underboss was bleeding, his face bruised and swollen. The room fell, dead silent. Roman wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, stood up, and walked over to Paulie. He didn't yell. He didn't scream. He simply looked down at the man with absolute, terrifying indifference. "You stole from the family, Paulie," Roman said softly. "No, boss, I swear." Roman looked at Chloe. "My accountant says otherwise, and I trust her numbers more than I trust your loyalty." Chloe's blood ran cold. She had exposed a financial truth, but she hadn't anticipated the visceral, violent reality of what that meant. She was suddenly confronted with the fact that her keystrokes had a body count. "Take him to the warehouse," Roman ordered softly. "Make sure he understands the cost of betrayal before he's gone." As they dragged a screaming Paulie away, Roman returned to his seat next to Chloe. He poured her a fresh glass of wine, his hand perfectly steady. "You did well," he told her, raising his glass in a mock toast. Chloe forced herself to pick up her glass, her hand trembling so violently the red wine almost spilled over the crystal rim. She took a sip, swallowing the bile rising in her throat. She realized then that Roman was testing her. He was trying to break her spirit, to pull her down into the blood and the dirt with him so she would never want to leave. She looked at Roman, giving him a small, perfectly practiced smile. You think you're making me complicit, she thought, her mind racing back to the encrypted code waiting silently on his servers. But you're just making me dangerous? The trap was set. All she needed now was the perfect moment to spring it. But as Roman reached under the table, his hand wrapping possessively over her bare knee, Chloe realized a terrifying truth. She was destroying a monster, but she was slowly falling in love with him too. The gilded cage was beginning to feel remarkably like a home, and that terrified Chloe more than the armed guards at her door. 6 months had passed since the night Paulie was dragged to his death. In that time, Chloe had washed over $40 million of Cavallaro Syndicate money. She had moved funds through shell corporations in the Cayman Islands, funneled cash into a sprawling commercial real estate development in downtown Providence, and purchased anonymous shares in legitimate tech startups. She was no longer just an appraiser, she was the architect of Roman's untouchable new empire. To reward her loyalty, Roman began granting her a terrifying amount of freedom. The locked doors became unlocked, the guards kept their distance. He even bought her a vintage seafoam green Aston Martin DB5, though she was only allowed to drive it along the private coastal roads of the estate. But the most dangerous shift was the change in Roman himself. The cold, calculating mob boss slowly revealed the man underneath a man who, quoted Hemingway, possessed a surprisingly tragic understanding of the world, and looked at Chloe not as property, but as an equal. The tipping point arrived in late November. Roman needed to personally attend a high-stakes, invite-only auction at Sotheby's on York Avenue in Manhattan. A previously undocumented masterpiece by Johannes Vermeer had miraculously surfaced, and Roman intended to buy it to legitimize $15 million of blood money. He needed Chloe by his side to verify the painting's authenticity before the final hammer fell. "You look breathtaking," Roman murmured, stepping into her suite. He was dressed in a bespoke charcoal Tom Ford tuxedo, a silver Patek Philippe watch gleaming on his wrist. Chloe turned from the vanity mirror. She wore a floor-length, blood-red silk gown that clung to every curve, her hair swept up in a loose, elegant twist. "I look like an accessory," she corrected, though her voice lacked its usual venom. Roman crossed the room, his eyes dropping to the delicate diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. "You are the only real thing in my life, Chloe. Don't ever diminish your worth." His knuckles brushed against her cheek, sending a jolt of electricity straight to her core. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, leaning into the touch before she caught herself. The auction was a blur of champagne, whispered threats in Italian, and staggering wealth. Chloe played her part flawlessly, giving Roman a subtle nod when the Vermeer was unveiled. The painting was authentic. The money was spent. The laundering was complete. But the victory was short-lived. As their armored Mercedes Maybach pulled onto the FDR drive, the rain coming down in a torrential sheet, the world exploded. An aggressively modified black Cadillac Escalade slammed into the side of their vehicle, sending the Maybach spinning violently against the concrete barrier. Shattered glass rained down like diamonds in the dim streetlights. Before Chloe could scream, Roman was on top of her, his heavy body shielding hers as the deafening roar of automatic gunfire erupted. "Get down! Keep your head down!" Roman roared over the chaos. It was an ambush by the Lombardi family, a brutal rival faction from Brooklyn who wanted Roman's new port territories. Victor, sitting in the front passenger seat, kicked his door open, returning fire with a compact Sig Sauer. The air was thick with the acrid smell of cordite and copper. Roman pulled a Glock 19 from his shoulder holster, his face a mask of lethal focus. He fired through the shattered window, his movements precise and deadly. But as he turned to pull Chloe lower into the floorboards, a bullet tore through the reinforced door panel and struck him just below the ribs. Roman grunted, a sharp intake of breath, but he didn't stop firing until the Escalade's engine block was destroyed and the surviving attackers fled into the night. "Drive," Roman commanded the bleeding driver. "Get us to the Westchester safe house. Now!" The next few hours were a bloody, terrifying blur. The safe house was a secluded, mid-century modern cabin hidden deep in the woods of Westchester County. Victor had to perimeter the property, leaving Chloe alone in the sterile, fluorescent-lit bathroom with a bleeding mob boss. "You need a hospital," Chloe said, her hands shaking as she pressed a thick towel against Roman's side. The white marble floor was already staining a dark, terrifying crimson. "No hospitals," Roman gasped, his skin pale, sweat beading on his forehead. "Lombardi has cops on the payroll. I go to an ER. I get a lethal injection in my IV." He looked up at her, his dark eyes vulnerable for the first time since she had met him. "There's a medical kit under the sink. You have to do it, Chloe. You have to stitch it." I appraise art. Roman, I don't do field surgery, she cried, panic rising in her throat. Chloe, look at me, he commanded, his voice weak but unyielding. He reached up, his bloody hand gripping her wrist. I trust you. Only you. Save my life. She could have let him bleed out. She could have walked out the door, found a police station, and triggered the encrypted back door she had built for the FBI. This was her out. This was the moment she had been praying for. But as she looked down at the man who had stolen her life, the man who had just taken a bullet to shield her body, her resolve shattered. She didn't see a monster. She saw Roman. Grabbing the medical kit, Chloe sterilized a needle and heavy surgical thread. For the next hour, she worked in agonizing silence, cleaning the through-and-through bullet wound and stitching his torn flesh. Roman didn't make a sound, though his jaw was clenched tight enough to crack his teeth. When she finally tied off the last stitch, she collapsed against the cold bathroom wall, sobbing quietly. Roman slowly pulled himself up, wincing in agony, and dragged himself over to her. He pulled her into his chest, burying his face in her hair. I've got you, he whispered, his bloody hands ruining her silk dress. I'm alive because of you. My life is yours, Chloe. Completely. She wrapped her arms around his waist, clinging to him in the dark. The backdoor code sitting on his servers in Rhode Island suddenly felt like a ticking time bomb, one that wouldn't just destroy his empire, but would destroy the only man she had ever truly, madly, and terrifyingly loved. The return to the Newport estate marked a dangerous paradigm shift. Roman's recovery took weeks, during which he ran his syndicate from the master bedroom. Chloe rarely left his side. The trauma of the ambush had burned away the remaining boundaries between them. They crossed the line from captor and captive into a fierce, all-consuming romance. Their nights were spent tangled in Egyptian cotton sheets. Their days were spent consolidating Roman's power and wiping the Lombardi family off the map. But while Roman's trust in Chloe was now absolute, he had even given her the master biometric cipher to his flagship Credit Suisse offshore accounts, the rest of his inner circle was not as blind. Victor had survived the FDR Drive ambush with a grazed shoulder and a dark, festering suspicion. He was a veteran of the underground, and his paranoia was the very thing that kept Roman alive for so long. Victor didn't believe in coincidences. A secret ambush, perfectly timed when Roman was vulnerable outside his fortress, felt like an inside job, and the only new element in Roman's life was the beautiful, quiet art appraiser. Chloe knew Victor was watching her. She could feel his cold, dead eyes tracking her every time she walked through the estate. What she didn't know was that Victor had hired a shadow team of black hat hackers from Eastern Europe to quietly audit the syndicate's internal servers. On a freezing Tuesday morning in January, the tension finally snapped. Chloe was in the subterranean server room, attempting to quietly dismantle the encrypted backdoor she had built months ago. She no longer wanted FBI agent Daniel Cross to raid the estate. She wanted to erase her betrayal and live the dark, opulent life she had chosen with Roman. She was typing furiously, lines of terminal code reflecting in her eyes, when the heavy steel door of the server room slammed shut and locked magnetically. Chloe spun around in her ergonomic chair. Victor stood by the door, a suppressed Heckler and Koch USP pistol resting casually against his thigh. He held a thick stack of printed server logs in his left hand. I always knew you were too smart to just be a pretty little pet, Victor said, his voice a gravelly whisper. He tossed the stack of papers onto her desk. My guys found it. An encrypted partition. A beacon, pinging an IP address registered to a shell company owned by the Department of Justice. Chloe's blood ran colder than the winter air outside. She stared at the papers. There it was. Her digital footprint. The undeniable proof that she was a rat. Victor, listen to me. Shut up, he snapped, raising the pistol, aiming it directly at the center of her chest. You broke his heart, you treacherous bitch. He loved you. But I love the family. And I'm going to blow a hole through your chest, roll you up in a carpet, and tell him you finally made a run for it. Chloe's mind raced at 1,000 miles an hour. If she died now, Roman would never know the truth. But if Victor showed him those papers, Roman would have to kill her himself. The syndicate rules were absolute. She needed to survive. And living in Roman's world had taught her how to play dirty. You're right, Victor, Chloe said, forcing her voice to stay calm, her hands slowly raising in surrender. There is a beacon, there is a back door to the FBI. But you're wrong about who put it there. Victor scoffed. Nice try. You're the only one down here. Am I? Chloe asked, taking a slow step toward him. I'm an art appraiser, Victor. I know carbon dating. I know brushstrokes. Do I look like a master coder to you? Do I look like someone who can bypass military-grade firewalls? Victor hesitated. His eyes narrowed. The beacon has been there for 8 months, Chloe lied smoothly. I found it weeks ago. I've been trying to trace it. And do you know whose terminal authorized the partition? She pointed a trembling finger at him. Yours. The security overrides required a level 1 clearance. Only you and Roman have that. I certainly don't. You're lying, Victor growled, but the gun wavered slightly. Check the digital signature on page 4, she challenged him. Victor, against his better judgment, glanced down at the papers on the desk. It was the distraction she needed. Chloe grabbed a heavy bronze paperweight from the desk and swung it with all her might. It connected with Victor's wrist with a sickening crack. He roared in pain, dropping the pistol. Before he could recover, Chloe kicked the gun under the server racks, scrambled backward, and slammed her hand on the emergency panic button installed under the desk. Alarms instantly shrieked through the mansion. Red strobe lights bathed the server room in a violent, pulsating glow. Victor lunged at her, his massive hands wrapping around her throat, choking the life out of her. I'll kill you! I'll kill you! He spat, his face purple with rage. Black spots danced in Chloe's vision. She clawed at his hands, kicking frantically. Just as she felt her consciousness slipping away, the steel door was kicked open with explosive force. Roman burst into the room, followed by 3 guards. Seeing Victor strangling Chloe, Roman didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. He drew his weapon and fired a single shot into Victor's shoulder. Victor screamed, collapsing to the floor. Chloe fell back, gasping for air, clutching her bruised throat. Roman was at her side in an instant, pulling her into his arms. Chloe, are you okay? Talk to me. He tried to kill me, Chloe rasped, tears of genuine terror streaming down her face. She pointed a shaking hand at Victor, who was bleeding on the floor surrounded by guards. He's the mole, Roman. He built a backdoor for the FBI. I found the logs. He realized I knew he was going to execute me. Roman, she's lying, Victor screamed, coughing up blood. She's the rat! Look at the papers! Look at the code! Roman looked at the printed logs scattered across the floor, then down at the deep, vicious bruises already forming on Chloe's delicate neck. His jaw tightened into a rigid line of absolute fury. He stood up, walking slowly over to Victor. He looked down at his oldest friend, his right-hand man for over a decade. You brought the feds to my door, Roman said softly, the betrayal in his voice chilling the room. And you laid your hands on my woman. Boss, I swear on my mother's grave. Take him to the harbor, Roman interrupted, not raising his voice. Weigh him down. Make sure he's breathing when he hits the water. The guards dragged a screaming, protesting Victor out of the room. The heavy steel door clicked shut, leaving Roman and Chloe alone in the red glow of the server lights. Roman walked back to her, kneeling on the floor. He gently picked up the printed logs, tearing them into pieces without reading them. He didn't care what they said. He had made his choice. He pulled Chloe against his chest, kissing the top of her head. It's over, Roman whispered, his hands shaking as he held her tight. He can't hurt you anymore. You're safe. I'll always protect you. Chloe buried her face in his expensive shirt, breathing in the scent of gunpowder and cologne. She had won. She had saved Roman, saved herself, and eliminated the only threat to her new life. But as she stared blankly at the torn pieces of paper on the floor, a cold, suffocating realization washed over her. She had just framed an innocent man to protect her own lies, sending him to a horrific death without a second thought. Roman hadn't broken her by forcing her to wash his money. He had broken her by teaching her how to survive in his world. She was no longer a victim trapped in a gilded cage. She had become the monster that owned it. The winter that followed Victor's execution was the coldest Rhode Island had seen in a decade. The Atlantic Ocean slammed against the Newport cliffs like a battering ram, freezing into jagged ice formations along the rocks. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere was equally glacial. Chloe had survived, but survival had demanded a metamorphosis. The quiet, analytical art appraiser was dead, buried somewhere in the digital ashes of the Cavallaro Syndicate's servers. In her place stood a woman forged in paranoia and draped in unimaginable power. With Victor gone, Roman had elevated Chloe to a position of absolute authority. She wasn't just managing the books anymore. She was dictating the movements of international shell companies, liquidating physical assets, and consolidating Roman's wealth into an untouchable fortress at Coutts & Co., an exclusive private bank headquartered in London. Roman was deeply, obsessively in love with her. She was his savior, the woman who had bled for him and rooted out the traitor in his midst. But Chloe's nights were plagued by a cold, suffocating dread. She had built her empire on a foundation of innocent blood, and she knew that in the Mafia, ghosts never stay buried. The reckoning arrived on a bleak Tuesday morning in late February. Chloe was in the conservatory, nursing a black coffee, when Dominic, the newly promoted captain of the guard, walked in. His face was pale, his eyes darting nervously. He handed her a thick, heavily sealed envelope. "Courier brought this to the front gate," Dominic muttered. "Addressed to the boss. It's marked from Kroll Inc." Chloe's stomach plummeted. Kroll was the premier corporate intelligence and risk consulting firm in the world, a real-life organization composed of former intelligence officers and forensic accountants. They didn't send casual correspondence. "I'll take it to him," Chloe said, her voice perfectly level despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. She found Roman in his study, standing by the fireplace, reviewing shipping manifests. He smiled warmly as she entered, the hard lines of his face softening instantly. "Morning, my love." "A package arrived," she said, holding it out. "From Kroll." Roman's brow furrowed. He took the envelope, slicing the heavy wax seal with a silver letter opener. He extracted a bound dossier, his eyes scanning the cover page. As he read, the warmth completely vanished from his eyes, replaced by a hollow, terrifying void. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing against Chloe's chest. "Victor," Roman whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a death knell. He flipped to the next page, his breathing slowing to a dangerously calm rhythm. Victor was paranoid. After the ambush, he didn't just audit the servers. He hired an external forensic team at Kroll on a dead man's switch. If he went missing for more than 48 hours, they were instructed to complete the audit and mail the findings directly to me. Roman slowly looked up at Chloe. The absolute heartbreak in his dark eyes was more devastating than a loaded gun. "They analyzed the keystroke telemetry and the IP routing," Roman said, his voice cracking. He dropped the dossier onto his mahogany desk. Victor didn't build the back door. His terminal was cloned. The code was compiled using a distinct syntax, the exact same syntax used in your Sotheby's appraisal macros. Chloe couldn't breathe. The walls of the study were closing in. She took a step back, her hands trembling. "Roman, You made me murder my brother," Roman interrupted, the words tearing out of his throat like shattered glass. He didn't yell, he just stared at her, utterly broken. "I looked him in the eye while he begged for his life, and I ordered him thrown into the harbor. For you. Because I trusted you." He reached into his shoulder holster and drew his Glock 19. Chloe froze. This was it. The gilded cage was finally snapping shut. "I did it to survive," she cried out, tears spilling over her lashes. "You kidnapped me! You dragged me into this hell!" "I was trying to escape, but then I fell in love with you. I dismantled the code. Roman, I stopped the FBI." "It doesn't matter," Roman whispered, his hand shaking as he aimed the weapon at her chest. "The syndicate rules are absolute. Treason is death. And you took my soul. Chloe." He chambered around. The metallic click echoed like thunder. Chloe closed her eyes, waiting for the burning impact. She had played the game, and she had lost. But the gunshot never came. Instead, Roman let out a ragged, agonizing sob. He lowered the gun, the heavy weapon slipping from his fingers and clattering against the hardwood floor. He fell to his knees, burying his face in his hands. He was the most feared man on the East Coast, a ruthless apex predator, and she had completely dismantled him. He loved her too much to pull the trigger. Before Chloe could speak, the deafening thwack, thwack, thwack of heavy rotor blades rattled the stained glass windows of the study. Dominic burst through the double doors, an assault rifle strapped to his chest. "Boss, we have a massive problem. Black SUVs at the main gate, 2 FBI Black Hawks circling the perimeter. It's a full raid." Victor's dead man switch hadn't just alerted Roman. It had automatically forwarded the server logs to Special Agent Daniel Cross. They finally had their undeniable probable cause. Roman looked up from the floor, his eyes dead. "Stand down, Dominic," he ordered softly. "Tell the men to drop their weapons. It's over." "Roman, no!" Chloe rushed forward, grabbing his shoulders. "We can fight this! We can escape!" "I have nothing left to fight for," he replied, looking right through her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy titanium flash drive. He pressed it into her palm. The cryptographic keys for the Coots accounts. $400 million. Untraceable. Take the secret tunnel to the cove. The Zodiac boat is fueled. Go. "I'm not leaving you." "You left me the moment you lied about Victor," he said coldly, turning his back on her as the sound of FBI sirens wailed in the distance. "Run, Chloe. Before I change my mind and let them take you, too. Chloe stood there, clutching the titanium drive, the sheer weight of her choices crashing down on her. She looked at the broken man on the floor, the man who had terrified her, protected her, and ultimately sacrificed his own empire for her survival. She turned and ran. 2 days later, the news cycle was dominated by the fall of the Cavallaro crime family. Roman was in federal custody, held without bail in a high-security facility in Manhattan. The media painted him as a monster finally brought to justice, but the FBI was furious. When they raided the estate, they found the servers wiped clean and the offshore accounts completely drained. They had the mob boss, but they had lost the empire. Deep in the VIP lounge of a private terminal at Heathrow Airport in London, Chloe sat in a leather armchair sipping a glass of rare vintage champagne. She wore a tailored Alexander McQueen suit, her posture flawless, her expression unreadable. Across from her sat a very nervous, high-priced defense attorney. The wire transfer cleared, Miss Bennett, the attorney said, wiping sweat from his brow. The judge has been compromised, and the key forensic witnesses have suddenly decided to retract their statements. The federal case against Mr. Cavallaro will collapse within the month. He will be released on a technicality. Excellent, Chloe murmured, staring out at the tarmac where a private jet was waiting. But you understand the conditions? The attorney pressed. The FBI will freeze his domestic assets. He won't have a penny to his name. And his rivals have already carved up his territory. If he walks out of that prison, he is a king without a kingdom. He is completely dependent on whoever holds the Coots capital. I am well aware, Chloe said, a slow, dark smile spreading across her lips. She dismissed the attorney and stood up, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling window. She remembered the cold steel of Roman's revolver under her jaw all those months ago. She remembered his arrogant certainty. Roman had tried to break her, to make her fit into his world. But he had underestimated her. She hadn't just survived the fire, she had learned how to control it. She had bought his freedom, but in doing so, she had bought him. When he walked out of that federal prison, he would have nowhere to go, no one to trust, and nothing to his name except her. She took a slow sip of champagne, her reflection ghostly in the glass. The art appraiser was gone forever. The syndicate boss was defeated. Now, the queen ruled the ashes. You belong to me now, she whispered to the empty room. That ending left me absolutely speechless. Chloe completely flipped the script, proving that the most dangerous person in the room is always the one you underestimate. Did she go too far framing Victor, or was it the ultimate survival move? Let me know if you are Team Roman or Team Chloe in the comments below. If you want more dark, twisty Mafia romances, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this story.